It was two different guys. Right.
There's a little blue box here. It's not the one down there.
I'm gonna show you. I'm gonna show you. Right, right there, like right here.
Okay.
Yeah. Maybe no, I don't know, maybe nobody's joining us on my own. I heard rumors that there were people who did at one time.
Williams thinks they're riding on the road.
What's that?
Williams thinks they're-
Well, let's wait for the wins. Anybody do anything fun this weekend?
What's your name?
It's always fun to have people gathered. I always appreciate that.
They have a sale for a little, what do you call it, like a spring show at the Arboretum right now. So all the little booths are set up inside. So if you go to the Arboretum,
Really?
I bought some really amazing chocolate chip cookies.
You did?
Yeah, I did not bring them to share, of course, but. they're-
Just to brag about that fact you have.
Trust me, they're amazing.
Your coffee is here. You want to go grab some coffee before we start?
So they did the whole day of the week, and they walked by everybody.
Grab some coffee, grab some coffee. So are you a member at the Arboretum?
Yeah.
So you go out there and walk around?
Yeah.
Do you know your way around there pretty well?
Yeah, well, yesterday was actually just, at some point they stopped and allowed pedestrians about the 3 mile drive. So they have a 3 mile walk now. But I've still been uncertain really how to navigate the 3 mile walk. So that was my goal yesterday. So yesterday I navigated the 3 mile walk.
I've only been there a few times, like maybe 3 times. Twice to do weddings.
Yeah.
And then once we went out there to see something that's blooming or blossoming that was supposed to be all the rage. But the last I was there was right before the pandemic. I think it was. And I got coming down Highway 5, I can see cars already all the way down it. I'm like, oh yeah. And and being the guy, the guy that I am, I hadn't created that much time between when I needed to be there and the time that it was currently. And so I thought, I'm gonna have to jump the line. I'm gonna have to. So I literally am driving the outgoing path up to the gate and the guy's like, and I go, "Here's the deal." They're like, okay, well, come on. Because I would have been, it's amazing how many cars were in line.
Just thinking of going, but then I thought nothing's in bloom.
Well, it has some kind, it's like a spring craft show. So there's some food vendors. There's some people selling arts and crafts.
It's inside.
It's inside. They have the one big hall of vendors, and then also in the main lobby area and upstairs by around the cafe.
We're chapter 17.
Yeah. I think so.
Well,
I don't
Maybe,
know.
if we get that far.
We might get all the way to chorus today, which I really don't.
Yeah, the only thing really showing is the crab apples are and the daffodils.
Thank you for your.
Thank you.
They're smart.
Right. Luke, where's Luke? It's just messing with you. Nothing when you see or half of what you see, nothing when you hear. But that's great. Yeah.
17.
I don't know about you people who need coffee in the morning. I don't say yes, that's all.
Got it. Go have some Mountain Dew.
Picked up on it. Nope,
No.
I didn't see a hand up, so Peggy's in charge of all the guests that maybe potentially come join us online. Well, good morning. Let me say a little prayer. Glad to be back with you. Lord Jesus, we're grateful for this morning. Every morning is a gift from you, and today it had sunshine. And so a bonus. And as we gather here looking out on your creation, in this beautiful place that you have given to us. We are going to open up your word. And we invite your spirit to come and lead us and guide us as we chew on it together, as we wrestle together, as we bang up against each other and try to figure out what it is that you are saying, what you have revealed in history and what you have revealed by the inspiration of your spirit. So God, come and lead us, we pray in your name. Amen. Well, who can tell us in just a couple of sentences where we were 2 weeks ago?
Chapter 16.
Yes, we were. And we were in a really, really important city. Do anybody remember where? Philippi. And there were a couple of really important stories where we met somebody, and then
Lydia?
we met Lydia, who was very important because she began to be a part of the way that Paul and his ministry was supported and encouraged. We also met another one who was nameless, but very significant. Earthquake, and the jailer, right? Think about it. This woman who sells purple all the way to this jailer who lives, in this dark, ugly place, every day, all day long.
Jeff, does this ever make you feel like you're wasting your time? When we can't remember what we studied.
It was 2 weeks ago. I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt. Philippi. Yeah. Anyway, today we're gonna be in 3 cities. We're gonna be in Thessalonica. We're gonna be in Berea. We're gonna get all the way to Athens, because I don't really think we're gonna get all the way to Corinth, but we'll see. We'll see. It's interesting. As you study scripture, and many of you have been doing this much longer than me. But it's really interesting because when we get to this chapter 17, and this, as the title here says, the uproar in Thessalonica, it's really fun. If you wanted to, you could go to 1st and 2nd Thessalonica, and you could read about the impact that ministry had, that impact of that church, what Paul's message was to that community. We see just a little glimpse here in the 17th chapter as we're again thinking about these journeys that Paul, as he's going into the world to offer this good news, this gospel. His life completely transformed, completely turned around, turned upside down with this message that he can't contain. He has to proclaim it. He has to tell it, or he might just explode. You get that sense, don't you? And so he goes into these communities in chapter 17, begins with him in Thessalonica, 100 miles from Philippi. So he's traveled 100 miles. And that's why, as Luke is describing, he talks about these other cities that he's gone through, the significant, helping us understand the journey that they've been on to get now to Thessalonica. So that'll be your homework for today. You can go home and read 1st and 2nd. It's not that hard. There's like 5 chapters of 1st, and I think there's like 3 chapters of 2nd. So it's not a hard read, but it's fun. It's fun because you get to see the importance that Paul saw in that church and the messages that he wanted them to have as they begin to be. And Thessalonica, some of you maybe have even been there. Has anybody been to Thessalonica? Some of you travel, so it's still a thriving city. It's still a thriving city, and there's still a thriving church there today. So someone want to read, as we will do, someone want to read the first 9 verses of chapter 17 of the book of Acts. And again, when I teach, pronunciation of names doesn't count. So you can just name whatever you want. So go ahead.
Okay, I'll take it.
You'll get the next one. Thank you.
After Paul and Silas had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a Jewish synagogue. And Paul went in, as was his custom, and on 3 Sabbath days argued with them from the scriptures, explaining and proving that it was necessary for the Messiah to suffer and to rise from the dead, and saying, "This is the Messiah, Jesus, who I am proclaiming to you." Some of them were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a great many of the devout Greeks, and not a few of the leading women. But the Jews became jealous, and with the help of some ruffians, there's a good word, ruffians, You don't see that word a lot.
The mother
With the help of some ruffians in the marketplace, they formed a mob and set the city in an uproar. While they were searching for Paul and Silas to bring them out to the assembly, they attacked Jason's house. When they could not find them, they dragged Jason and some brothers and sisters before the city authorities, shouting, "These people who have been turning the world upside down have come here also. And Jason has entertained them as his guests. They are all acting contrary to the decrees of the emperor, saying that there is another king named Jesus." The people and the city officials were disturbed when they heard this, and after they had taken bail from Jason and the others, they let them go.
I want to just pick up a little thing here in verse 6. When they could not find them, they dragged Jason and some brothers and sisters from the city authorities, shouting, "These people," here's what I wanted to focus on. "These people who have been turning the world upside down have come here also." And Jason is entertaining them as guests. They are acting contrary to the decrees of emperor, saying there is another king named Jesus. What's going on in verse 6? What do we learn from verse 6? Is there anything we can take away from verse 6? Is there a context understanding that we can draw from verse 6?
May that be said about us.
Say something more about that.
That we don't just go through the water calmly, but that it gets turned up a little.
I like that. All right. Go ahead.
Well, they were determined to make somebody pay for all this and bring somebody in. And so when they couldn't find who they were looking for, they grabbed the nearest people and hauled them in.
Yeah. And we're going to come back to Jason in a little bit. Yeah. It's the only time he shows up. The only time he shows up. But clearly was very important in terms of the birth of that church there in that town. So, and we'll get back to that in a second. Does anybody catch kind of the nuance that's here? It says, "These people," this is a quote, "these people who have been turning the world upside down have come here."
They got a reputation.
They got a reputation. And what do they have the reputation? It tells us what the reputation is from. From what? Yeah. And maybe even beyond, world upside down, suggesting that, oh, we know about these people and they've been in a lot of places and they've been saying the same thing over and over again. And that's problematic for us. What is it they're saying?
Jesus is king.
Yeah, Jesus is king. And what do we know about people who say Jesus is king as opposed to somebody else who's supposed to be king?
Bad guys.
It can get you in
The
trouble.
king won't like that.
Yeah, and they're gonna like that too much. And we also know the extent of the Roman kingdom at that time, the Roman world at that time. So, I mean, the reputation is out in front of them. They know who they are. They know the message which they are bringing, but it doesn't slow Paul down at all. Paul knows the context, knows the understanding, knows the reality of what he's doing, and yet he keeps doing it. What would you say, Judy?
I said, yeah, he does it.
Yeah, I kind of touched on it just a couple minutes ago, but why? Why? I mean, he has literally everything to lose, literally his life to lose, but yet it doesn't slow him down a bit. Matter of fact, in just one chapter, we're gonna pass through 3 cities that he has a significant connection to. Why?
He's cold.
He's called. Can you say something more about that? What does that mean?
If God calls you, you kind of have a need to answer. I mean, it's compelling. You don't have a choice.
Can I push back on you for just a minute? We've known each other forever, right? So I can push back on it. So is Elgin Manor called? Are you called?
Yeah.
Called to do what?
Oh,
I don't believe
I'm
that.
still trying to figure it out.
Because that kind of just rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? He was called. And because he was called, he was compelled. And because he was compelled, we get to see all of what God did in him. that rolls off the tongue. It usually rolls off the tongue, especially when we're talking about someone else. Someone else. But it seems to me, and maybe I'm wrong, it seems to me the gospel message is, as we receive this message, that there's a calling for us all. That we're now included. Go ahead.
I think of the nature of love, and Christian love gives itself away.
Mm,
You don't just keep it and hoard it for yourself. So that's kind of the take I have on that.
that Christian love is not something you hoard for yourself.
Right.
Wow, that's pretty profound, I think. Yeah. So,
It's the nature of love, to give yourself away and build up others, and that's the nature of love. If you just keep it for yourself, it doesn't grow. May make you feel good, but I think it's the nature of love to share it. And maybe that's part of what he felt.
I love that, Christine. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
I think you're right. And I think that that's the essence of Paul's career, of
Yeah.
his second career now as follower of Jesus. I think that's the really is that this transformational experience that he's had in his own life compels him. This love that he now knows, different than he knew before. The law was how he understood it, and it all mattered how he lived out the law that then earned him favor with God. Now, on that amazing experience that he had, that transformational U-turn that he went through, he now knows a love very differently than that. A love that is not measured by what he does, but because of God's love.
No.
This love, and now he's compelled to give it away. Go ahead.
It implies also that he's being led by the Spirit
Yeah,
and not with his own. He didn't sit down and draw a map. Why don't we go here? And why don't we go here?
Yeah.
You know, doors shut. Things came up to his mind. He had people who took him different places. And yeah, it's
Yeah.
like it's pieces that are given to him, and he's put this puzzle away, which ends up in this map here.
yeah, yeah, no, exactly. And it's very interesting when you actually see it laid out, right? The journey. What we know, the first journey he went out, and then the second journey he kind of backtracked.
Right.
And then the third journey, he went to places where he really had decided were very helpful in him and expanding the gospel, knowing his time was more limited at that point, recognizing it was catching up with him.
But I think that also happens with individuals in the church who are called to something. Because they'll meet someone and they say, have you ever thought of doing this? And then you volunteer to do that, and then that leads to meeting people that want you to do this. And then you end up with your own ministry or joining in a ministry or
Yeah.
whatever it is, and you just wake up in the morning and think, you know what, I think I'm gonna become a whatever at Colonial or wherever.
Yeah, I really appreciate what you're saying that, because I think that's why I'm grateful that we have the ability to remember. Because I think looking back, we can see that hand of God and that leading of the Spirit and our faithfulness, or lack thereof that time, but our faithfulness, and see, gosh, that had to be me being led. That had to be that the illumination that I willingly followed in order to experience and to be used by God. Isn't it fun to be able to look back and see those places? Yeah. What are the comments? Oh, it was interesting. One of the commentaries was talking about, well, how did they make some of the decisions they made? And this commentary was speculating that they kind of pooled their understanding of what they knew, maybe from stories or historical understanding or from things that they heard from other people. And they go, yeah, that should be a good place. Let's go there. And I don't know if that's true, but I thought that was kind of interesting, because how else would they know? How else, if they've never been to someplace, they're gonna go based on what they heard or what they know. And again, trusting that the Spirit was leading as well. So let's back up now. So Paul and Silas passed through these places. They're on the way to Thessalonica. It's a seaport, and so a lot of the world is coming and going. It's a bustling community. It's interesting because what was that word, Jeff, that we were surprised about hearing? Ruffians. The ruffians. It's interesting because what most commentaries believe, the ruffians were actually were like sailors. They were known to the world, and sailors, if they made a couple of sails and they didn't make captain, it's probably because they were dead. So many of those folks didn't make many trips. You know, that there weren't old sailors, but they were seasoned sailors that learned the hard way. And so they were rough and tough. They had to face all kinds of challenges. And so if you're going to get a group of ruffians, I'm going to guess that would be a great piece people to get. But we'll get to that as well. So Paul goes to Thessalonica, and where does he go first?
Temple.
Goes to the synagogue. Yes, he goes to talk to the Jews. But why? Why does he go talk to the Jews? I mean, isn't he called and isn't he commissioned to bring the good news to the Gentiles? Isn't that part of his commissioning? Isn't that part of his calling that we were just talking about? So if that is, why does he go to the Jewish synagogue first? Oh, they're receptive. We'll say something more about that. Why are they more receptive than anyone else? But you know they are. That's awesome. What's that?
Well, he was good.
He was Jewish. So what would that mean?
To make his own people, because I think at some other point he does complain or say that, you know, my people aren't accepting. this.
Yeah. It's a place to start, right? Some common ground that he can help to take what they know together and then begin to illuminate further. We'll come
Well,
back.
they're waiting for the Messiah.
They are waiting for the
It
Messiah.
fulfills prophecy.
Yeah. So he, in talking to the Jews, gets a chance to offer and proclaim to them, hey, that what you are waiting for is now here. Let me describe who that is. Yeah. And again, if he can get them to believe, then he's mobilized this army of folks who can also then proclaim as well. So it's pretty strategic. Go ahead, John.
I'm just thinking about the words we're using here. And we're using call, and we're using some other word that suggests that, you know, it wasn't their own idea. They weren't just drumming this up inside, but they were the other word that we used was led. You're led by someone, you're called by someone. I mean, if you're doing more than you could do if you were just thinking of it on your own. And so we look for who's leading them, who's calling them, and the answer is God. So that's, I mean, this should never have worked. This was a bad plan.
It was.
I mean, it's really, I mean, that's the thing we see through all of this from Acts. I mean, the church should have fallen apart in any number of places, but people just kept going because they were called and led to do this. I mean, it's kind of proof positive. There's something going on here.
I love that. And I want to pick up on that. Did you want to say something about that, David? Did you have your hand up? Oh, don't move in my class. 'Cause
He's
I will.
scratching his head. Wondering what I'm saying.
So of course that's profound. Of course that's reality. There is something bigger than this. As much as the human side of us will try to thwart it, there is something that my son, who is also a pastor, said to me the other day. He goes, you know, we worry and we pray and we're concerned about the future of the church, but it doesn't belong to us. It belongs to God. This is God's people. This is God's church. This is God's gathering. This that at the invitation of the Spirit. This is God gathering people to hear this good news. This love that we can't do anything to earn, but is offered to us. That we are compelled, led, called to share.
I think at the bottom of it is God will never leave us or forsake us or let us down. And I can't remember. That's good.
Yeah.
Oh,
Never leave us or
and,
forsake us.
And his mercy is new every morning. Great is his faithfulness.
Yeah.
So we can rest and relax, knowing that Joel living arms around us.
Paul must have known that, right?
Yeah.
Because think about that whole list in Hebrews of all the stuff he went through, right? And he never stopped. Even knowing that he was headed to a place where he was going to lose his life.
Yeah.
He never stopped, never gave up. He must have understood that God never would leave him orphan, that he wouldn't be left as an orphan, that he wouldn't be left without hope. Yeah, that's great. Anyone else have a comment? So he goes to the Jewish synagogue. He starts sharing with them and being in dialogue with them. He tells them the story, right? That they're waiting for the Messiah. Well, the Messiah has come. The Messiah had to suffer and rise from the dead, saying, "This is the Messiah." I'm in verse 3. this is the Messiah, Jews whom I proclaim to you. Some of them were persuaded and joined Paul as disciples. This goes back to Jeff's comment again, right? So, I mean, Paul was probably pretty clever. He was a Pharisee. He was well taught, well versed, so he probably could put a few sentences together. But on the other side of it, was he that clever that he could convince Jews that the Messiah, different than the Messiah that they were expecting and hoping for, had actually come? We know that it was compelling enough that some believed. Was his story that compelling? It was the testimony of one person, of a couple people. The testimony of what had happened earlier in Acts in Jerusalem, the growth of the church. We know that the story has gotten out, right? Because they know who these people are. The story's gotten out. Go ahead.
Well, right in that one sentence, think how hard it would be. So I'm the Jew, and I see that the other people that are interested in this are Greeks and the women, you know? So it's not like it's popular that I'm gonna be persuaded by these Greeks believing and women believing, but it's interesting how the group gets pulled together with all these disparate parts.
I'm really glad that I have that circled, but I probably would have just passed right by that. I'm really glad you pointed that out because it suggests that there were a few Jews, right? Because it says some of them, meaning the Jews that he's talking, some of them were persuaded, as did a great many of devout Greeks. Now, what do we know about? We're going to get to this when we get to Athens in a couple of verses, but what do we know about Greeks? They got a lot. They got a pantheons of gods. So the fact that they were convinced that Jesus represented the work of the one true God, that's profound. That's amazing. That we can't just kind of glaze over that. And so it's Jews, it's Greeks, and women, but not just women. What's the word? Leading women. These are women who have something to lose. If they are not becoming followers of Jesus in a culture, in an environment where Judaism is kind of prestigious, probably, in terms of the religious movement in those days. And so were they leading women in the temple? Were they leading women in the commerce that was there? We don't know. We don't know for sure, but they're leading women. None of the commentaries I read wanted to deal with the word leading, interestingly enough. But we can espouse on that. We can think about that as well. So it's this interesting group of people, right? The reason why I had it circled, because I'm always thinking about what the significance that is for us today, right? Okay. So if this is some of the early movements of the church, if this is some of the early work of the Spirit, gathering people together to be in a community around this message of a God who's so faithful that he came to this world, died, was crucified so that we might have true understanding of our hope for today and our hope for the future. What does this suggest about the church for us today?
All inclusive.
Yes. Why have we not done better at that then all these years later? What is it? What's the hurdle that keeps us from following that model? Because we see it in other communities as well throughout Scripture. It's on and on and on and on, examples of that throughout Scripture. Why is it that that's something that we've had a hard time figuring out? Or have we had a hard time figuring it out? Any thoughts about that? No.
Well, I think we figured out, I mean, if you look at who's attending churches, those are dominated by women now, but not the leadership. So we haven't quite figured out the leadership aspect of women being able to lead. So Tom and I visited a Southern Baptist church when we moved to Florida. And I think the second week we were there, the pastor, there was 5,000 people in the church, said, could all the deacons come forward? And oh yeah, you can bring your wife with you. And
Even but the Southern Baptists are really reaping whirlwind about this because women are leaving the Southern Baptist Church in droves. I mean, Beth Moore just quick, they kicked Saddleback out of the Southern Baptist Conference because they had a few women teaching in their staff, and so they said you can't be Southern Baptist anymore. I mean, these are, the best people they've got, and they're quitting because of the gender issue.
And then they were going to have, he said, and remember our church picnic is next Saturday, so you guys would need help setting up the baseball diamonds and whatever. All you women just get in the kitchen and start cooking. So I went like this to Tom and I said, no, last Sunday.
Thank you for saying that. We're leaving.
Whenever I think of this, and I just have never, ever thought like that. And I've never been in communities where that was the case that I was aware of. As I look back, I can see where it was mostly male and there were significant roles for women, but it was mostly males who had the pulpit. And but I look back over my life, and it by far, my relationship with Jesus was formed much more by the women in my life than by the men in my life. I've learned a lot from the men in my life, but in terms of me, in terms of my relationship with Jesus, my personal relationship with Jesus, it's been much more shaped by the women in my life, which always sends me back to that notion that we'll know a tree by its fruit, right? And so why don't we look at the fruit that is offered, and why don't we wake up to that? Anyway, that's a side point. Let's go back to this. Why as a church have we not figured this thing out in terms of who we invite into the life of our church and who is welcome in the life of our church? Why is it that we find ourselves more gravitating towards, similar or like-minded, or
We're more comfortable.
we're more
We
comfortable?
just become too comfortable.
Yeah, that's a great statement. I mean, let's think about that for a second. Most of us, again, I think that's one of the indictments of the church today, is that we think church is about us. We think that going to church is about us. It's my experience. It's what I take away from it. So it's how I leave feeling better or feeling good, or did I see my friends? And all those things are byproducts, but it's not the main function of the church, right? What's the main function of the church?
God, love neighbor.
Worshiping God, spelled out by what?
Love God, love neighbor.
Yeah. I mean, it's a chance for us to go, thank you, God, that you invite us into a relationship. And you invite us in the relationship, you give us tasks. And the task is to keep loving God. And then in turn, as Christine also said too, the gift and the opportunity to pass that love on to others. If we could get recentered as a church, the church could get recentered on that. Imagine where that leading might lead us to, where that call might be more clearly heard and understood. I again, standing in this beautiful building and say, Jesus, I mean, once we decided that we were going to make the church institutional, as opposed to they were the first century, then we were feeling compelled to keep the institution alive. And compromise has happened all the time when we are trying to institutionalize it and sustain the institution of the church. They were much more able and nimble in the first century. They pooled their resources and said, how much good can we do? And they thought about their community around them. They thought about the extent of how they could be a blessing to their community. And so I'm not saying that larger churches that are institutionalized can't continue to do those good things. I think it's just harder for us to remember to think about those things. So, yeah.
The chaplain at the
Yeah,
VA
yeah, preach it.
hospital that was serving my husband was a Black man. And he and I talked theology whenever he was in there. And I asked him about his denomination. He said, I'm a National Baptist. And I said, what is that? And he said, it is the survivor of the slave churches in the South. And I said, well, that can't be a big deal here in Minneapolis. He said, if you see a Baptist church in Minneapolis that's Black, they are National Baptist. He said they're all over the city. And I just thought that was really eye-opening. So
Never heard that term before.
yeah, it's just like Southern Baptist, but it's national. Baptist of America. And they're all black, they're like American AME.
Yeah, I was just at the AME, there's other groups.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I found it interesting watching the draft in football.
Hmm.
And the black players, when their name is called, they give all the glory to God,
Many of them do,
you know, and then the others, no, you know, it's interesting.
That's
We
like
have
the
a lot to learn these days from the black churches.
Interesting.
Yeah, yeah. There's also, well, always throughout Acts, three actions. There's, I accept, there's, I reject, and there's, we'll look into it more.
What's your observation of that?
True. That, you know, we don't necessarily have to get 100% of everyone buying in, but, you know, it's, but if you put the word out there, you'll have those three responses.
So scatter the seeds wide and
On your why question, I think there's also corporate ego in that we're in and you're not. And we get to make that decision. And there's power in it.
Assimilate or leave.
say again?
Assimilate or leave.
Assimilate. Yeah. Well, that is the expectation, right?
Shouldn't be.
Yeah. It is interesting, because that's how churches have operated forever, right? We're the entity, you're new.
You're the target.
So if you want to be a part of us, you come and that's why when we look at new people coming into like the church, how much voice do they get? How much does their opinion count? How much does their observations count? How much would their ideas count compared to those who've been around for a while? What if God were leading and guiding? How would God do that? Would there be an epiphany that would happen in our midst? Pray for that every day. Or could it be a new infusion that might come into the life of a church with new ideas and new thoughts that would force us to go, ponder that for a minute. But that's not usually what happens, right? Usually what happens is we're guarding our institution. What do we usually do? We pull back and go, no, that's not how we think. That's not what we do. And that's how we get stuck on women, and women have a certain role and that's all the role they have. And so get in the kitchen, start cooking as we go. Make the baseball fields? I don't know, that just seems so weird. So, somebody else have a comment about that? It's interesting, isn't it? That's not the message we're seeing in Acts. It's not how the church is forming and beginning to grow. It's the seeds are being cast wide, and those who would hear, those who would be listening, those who would be following. I want to talk a little bit about Jason before we get too far. We're still in Thessalonica. We haven't got too far yet. So the Jews get jealous. Why? For the same reason we're just talking about, right? They're recognizing that there's a threat against that which they have felt and believed and understood and orientated their life on for hundreds and hundreds of years. And there's a threat against it. There's momentum. They've heard about these people, and people are changing their minds. There's churches that are gathered. Things are happening that have never happened before. People are aware of this. And so they get a little worried. Is this going to happen here? Is there going to be another one of these, whatever they called it, this Pentecost moment that happened in Jerusalem? Is that going to happen here? Is that going to turn the apple cart completely upside down? We need to protect that. And so they go to look for Paul and Silas. And of course, they're smart, right? So what do? They go to the governing authority that's there and say, this isn't just about us. This is about your authority. Can you imagine? They're proclaiming there's a different king than the king that we are supposed to serve. You better do something about that. Well, they're worried. Why? Because they have a free status. Thessalonica is kind of an interesting town. It has a free status. They can kind of operate the way they want to under their Roman watch, but they can kind of operate as long as they pay their taxes and as long as they don't get too outrageous.
they can kind of freely do what they want to do. Why? Because it puts a lot of money in the Rome's coffers. But if they go too far, Rome will sweep in. And so that's what they're appealing to as these Jewish leaders go to the Roman authorities and say, hey, don't you want to do something about this? And so they go to look for Paul and Silas, they can't find him. And so they go to find Jason, right? And Jason has welcomed them into their house. We don't know that much about him, other than the fact that he must be one of those people that was open to it, heard it, listened, and believed, because he invites them into their house, recognizing the potential threat for himself and his family, right? Possible, right? Likely. And he gets dragged out and he's taken to the authorities. We know he serves some time in jail because they have to bail him out and they have to let him go. Jason is a newer convert, and yet he was willing to go through all of that. What does that suggest? Is there a message behind that message? Go ahead, Christine.
I think of Jesus, how he endured the cross for the joy that he discovered, that he began after he was crucified. Maybe that's part of it too.
So the suggestion is that there was such a transformation, such a conversion,
Right,
that
right,
he was compelled with that understanding
right.
of life. And
And for mercy and grace, sometimes all you can do is just lie there and let go and let God.
Yeah, I was just saying, I would summarize this for myself as saying, I like Jason's church better.
better than what?
Better than, he's demonstrating right behavior versus right belief. Because all he knows is love, right? All you heard is there's this thing that happened. I mean, I don't know if he's been studying whatever. I don't know if he's Jew or Greek or whatever. I don't know.
Yeah, we don't know.
Right? He's just Jason born. And so he's just welcoming, right? And as we've said for the last 2 or 3 weeks, right? He didn't just see these people as beloved. He also saw them as wanted, and he wanted them in his home. He could have said, "Oh, those are beloved people. Keep going." But you're beloved, stay out on the street though. Welcoming him into his home, that's a whole different level of a loving neighbor, right? You can love your neighbor by being friendly in a porch way. That's a way. This was actually putting some skin in the game, as Jesus does, and saying, "Come into my home, come into my living room." And I know it's going to be risky for me. It's going to cost me something potentially, but I'm also gaining something. So for me, that's a very nice model of not worrying about what about rules, but knowing that I'm doing the best I can with the tools I have right now to love someone, and I'm trusting that God did it because this is a loving gesture.
I love the idea of this skin in the game. Skin in the game. It goes back to what I was sharing earlier, that when we show up to church, we have skin in the game, right? Let's skin in the game suggests to me a bit of a sacrifice, a bit of giving up my own needs, my own wants, for the good of others. I think of that as skin in the game. Because it's okay to have, we can have all kinds of intellectual thoughts and beliefs and understandings, and we can even orientate our life around that mentally. But skin in the game is when we actually live that out, live those convictions out in real life in real time. I appreciate that. And I think about skin in the game, what that means for us to actually truly live out that gospel. Paul is exemplifying it he's just, everything he does is exemplifying that he's got skin in the game. And again, we can't forget it. And he's compelled by what has happened to him. Something significant there's been a transformation in such a way that it's compelled. He can't but do it. And that skin in the game is becoming transformational for people.
One of the things to remember about Jason, how high hospitality was considered in Middle East, and especially that to not have strangers coming into your neighbor, into your synagogue, and now welcome them in. But that's a high priority as well.
showing hospitality.
Yeah, we see that, right? The sun's going down and travelers are passing through, come and sleep in my outer room, and I'll give you a piece of bread and I can get you on your journey the next day. That's the expectation going forward.
I was just taking a different tack on this.
Oh, please.
When we studied Luke, it was always pointed out how with the contrast and how he felt about women. So this follows Lydia, when Lydia invited him into his home. People were baptized, and I don't remember reading anything about how the town Jews were inflamed by this, but now in this case, it is. So I think he also really applauds women. And it's just the contrast that in one case it was really nice, and the next case it's not.
Oh, that's interesting. So I appreciate you saying that because, again, the Jews afraid they're going to lose their status, right? Greeks and women. Are you joking? I mean, what's this world coming to? If all of a sudden we're supposed to in some way embrace all of that, that's going to ruin Judaism. That's going to ruin what we've got going here. And again, that's not necessarily an indictment just on the Jews. That's an indictment on all of us. I mean, this one of the things I say whenever we have a new members class in this church, I always say, as I'm addressing our congregation and the new members, I said, this congregation is different from here on out. Now we have them, their ideas, their thoughts, their perspectives, their understanding. We are a different place. And if we don't embrace that, then what happens is, no, we're waiting for you to get, what was the word you used? No, the Borg do it, in Star Trek. Where we have to, what was that word? We have to, when you join something, you
Assimilate.
assimilate, thank you. We wait for them to assimilate to be more like us, as opposed to who they are joining us and how that can refresh us and renew us. I knew we'd get there. I was just seeing what we were talking
remembering the board. I don't like the
Star Trek assimilation.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, in God's mercy and grace, we are very inclusive, and also exclusive. We're exclusive in the fact that we're inclusive, I think.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I thought it'd be just helpful in terms of recognizing what was happening and the importance of Thessalonica. Because we do again have these two letters, which we believe is probably Paul's first letter. So this is Paul's first letter to the church, and we have two letters there. So obviously it's a significant foothold in terms of how Christendom will then go out into the world. And as I looked at First and Second Thessalonians, there were some key theological notions that Paul, in writing those letters, was trying to encourage them to remember, encourage them to know, encourage them to understand. They had this first experience as they were preached to, and they were like, okay, we're in. And then to undergird them and encourage them, he gives them these understandings of what this means then to be followers of Jesus. One of the things that he talks about in the beginning of the first letter is the lordship of Christ. One of the things he really is saying, okay, don't just choose to follow another philosophy or another religious system. No, this is a real life entity. This is an ongoing, living, breathing relationship with God. So this lordship of Jesus is very important, and it still is, right? It's not just, again, it goes back to this, this idea. It's not just here's a whole new set of rules for us to follow. That ushering in this relationship with Jesus is just a whole new set of rules. You had the Jewish rules. Jesus himself says, "I didn't come to undo the law, fulfill the law, and I fulfill it in my relationship with you." So always about Jesus, pointing to what Jesus wants first. It's the notion of baptism, right? The dying of the old self and the new life that comes in our relationship with Jesus. And so that being the focus, don't just now develop a whole bunch of new rules to follow, continue to look to Jesus. Why? Because that's when we're going to get called. That's when we're going to get led. And that's where we're going to be on track to where God is leading us. He also talks about that it's got to be a conversion. You got to choose a side. You got to pick. Paul understanding that in terms of his own life, again, that metanoia experience, which, what is the word metanoia, the Greek word metanoia mean again?
Not believe so.
It means to turn around. It means to turn around. That Paul literally was going one direction and he meets Jesus and he's turned around going the opposite direction. And you can't get there that direction. And so there has to be, you can't kind of straddle the fence. You can't kind of have it both ways. You got to make a decision. And so there's this notion of this conversion. And I think that's where a lot of churches have gotten this notion that we need to have that spiritual birthday. I don't think so much that you have to have that spiritual birthday as much as it's helpful to have that spiritual birthday. It's helpful to know that time when you go, I once was and now I am. And I can look back on that. I can see that and remember that. And that offers that hope that there was a change in my life. Now, maybe I haven't got too far away from that. Maybe I need to step up my game a little bit. I need to lean into that Lordship of Christ. But there's that point where we need to acknowledge that Jesus is the Lord of our lives. Talks about, go ahead.
I think about the idols and everything they used to have in the churches, and somebody once told me that God is God, the only God there is.
Yeah.
There's only one God, the rest are just idols and.
First commandment, right?
Well,
Know that God. The third thing he talks about is the blessing of the Holy Spirit. And again, that was one of Jesus' great encouragements to his disciples. As the disciples go out and as they begin to do their transformational work, Jesus says, I'm going to give you the Holy Spirit. And again, for us living 2,000 years later, when we become followers of Jesus, we hear about this experience that God promises, that when we have this conversion experience, we get this gift of this advocate that's going to help us and support us and encourage us. Always present, but now in a new way to lead us and guide us. And so he talks about this blessing so that when you feel that call, when you feel that, when you need to feel encouraged, when you're Jason and the authorities are at the door, there's a conviction, there's an encouragement, there's a support there, there's a reminder there that helps. Okay, I can face this. God promises to be with me, will lead me and guide me. It had to be the conviction that Paul had as he faced so many of the challenges that he faced. They talk about prayer. And as we're going into the second down letter, he talks more about prayer and how we need to be in communication, how we need to set aside time and be in communication with God. It's two sides of that, though, right? There's the prayers that we offer, but there's the recognition and the realization of what? That maybe God hears our prayers, which would suggest what?
Answers?
What's that?
Answers?
Answers? And answers coming from who?
God.
From a God who actually cares about our prayers. It suggests an intimacy between the relationship. It points back into the Lordship of Christ, that there is a living, breathing, reality relationship that can be had and could be understood. And then there's this leading that's going to guide us in terms of how we live out our life. I mean, he's preaching some good stuff in these two letters that he writes to the Thessalonian church. That prayer, I think there are times when we in our those who've been on the journey for a while, we can get ourselves into kind of rote prayers. We can get ourselves into kind of prayer patterns. We can get ourselves into these normative conversations that we have God routinely. And think about that if that were your friendship. Think about if that's how you talk to the people you cared about. How bored would they get with you in a real hurry? How slow would the growth be in your relationship if it was just the same things over again? And by the way, I mean, my kids groan when I tell a story that I've told 7 or 8 times before. I mean, on and on and on, right? I mean, it's not that God doesn't care about the things and issues and stuff in my life, but it's a real life, active, engaged relationship. There should be that sense of growth that comes from it. That this lordship of Christ, this invitation to turn around and face that and embrace it and invite it into our lives is an active living relationship. And practice that in the ways that you pray and communicate. And then, I love that. maybe even have the expectation that there's gonna be an answer. One of the, what word am I looking for? Let's say complaints, but that doesn't capture it.
Assimilation.
There you go.
Yeah, if all else fails, just say assimilation. Yeah, I guess I'll just say complaint because it'll help me get to where I need to be. I think one of the things when people come to visit me, and we're having coffee and we're chatting and they're talking about the relationship with God. And they're complaining about where they are in their journey or describing where they are in their journey. Sometimes it gets to a place where they get frustrated with those people who talk about answered prayer in their life. Like, I don't get answered prayer in my life. You know, am I praying wrong? Am I not praying right? Am I not worthy of it? Or are those people just making that up? They just want to believe that God's answering their prayers. And so they are trusting and believing that, you know, God cares about their prayers and God's leading them in prayers. So you kind of have to make a little bit of a decision, right? You kind of say, well, if my prayers are literally just me getting stuff off my chest, they're just a process that I go through in order to kind of get stuff out and kind of out there. And just, you know, I named it. So no, I'm afraid of this. I'm concerned about this. I'm hopeful about this. I'm wondering about this. I'm looking to understand and to know something. Just kind of, well, there's probably some value to that. But what if we were to decide, oh, no, there is a living, active relationship we can have with a God who is the God of creation, we as the creator created. Well, what does that then suggest about our prayers? Does it suggest that maybe there is somebody actually listening, that there maybe is answers? Does that make us any better than anyone else?
Puts us in a better place.
It does? Okay. Tell me more about that. What better place to put us?
Well, you can move from just going from a wish list and an agenda, here's God, what I need today, and, you know, take care of it, goodbye, to just to being more open and seeing results. And the results might not necessarily be what you thought they were gonna be. I think that's a huge advantage of being old. Really, because you can, in time, look back and see, oh, you know what, God did answer that, or has heard all these years.
That doesn't offset some of the other.
Of being old?
Yeah.
Oh, I see. I had to catch up. Huh? Yes, right. Has any of you ever kept prayer journals? Have any of you ever done prayer journals?
I was gonna say, you really need to write them down because you forget what you've been praying for.
Yeah.
And, you know, I have files this big of stuff. But, you know, I'm looking at 2006, this is what I was praying for. And it's just interesting how everything works out. Why was I even thinking like that in 2006?
Yes.
But it's interesting to backtrack and see how all of those things work out. And then it's interesting to see the things that I'm still praying for the exact same thing now. So that's where I haven't seen what I was praying for answered, but if you don't ever write it down, there's no way you remember. Because I have people ask me in here for prayer or in another Bible study I'm in. So if I don't write those down and do that praying, then I'm not going to remember that I was praying for such and such.
A couple of summers ago, I was cleaning out some stuff in our basement, getting rid of a bunch of stuff, and I stumbled upon my prayer journal from 1975. And I was earnestly praying that Trish Walton would come to know Jesus so I could marry her someday. That didn't work out. What do you say?
You want to talk about that more?
No. Because you know that, so no.
I sometimes wonder whether we are praying the right way. Because God already gave us, Jesus already gave us the way to pray in the Garden of Gethsemane. Are we always praying and asking for what we want and not saying, but your will be done? God is listening to all our prayers, whether we said correctly or not. we already praying?
I quoted that actual passage yesterday in my sermon. That we oftentimes get disappointed, we often get frustrated, and we feel cheated because maybe we're not praying that this God, if you are a God and you are a God who loves me, then you will ... as opposed to as this converted follower of Jesus, recognizing the grace and mercy upon which I now live. Not my will. But yours.
Because we saw the humanness of God when he prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane, saying, I don't want this. And again, he's ended by saying.
Hey, hold that thought for one more second. I think that image that we get from that makes me want to be that much more of a follower of Jesus. And maybe some of the other stuff that I read and understood about my relationship with Jesus. Because God came the whole way. To me in terms of that humanness. The point where he recognized the reality of what in his humanness, what that was going to be. That he was going to suffer, he was going to die. And if there's another way, could we do that? But sometimes there isn't another way, is there? Sometimes I have to forgive. Sometimes I have to move towards someone in need. Sometimes I have to confess the situation, circumstances, and I have to turn away from that. I mean, there are all those things in our walk with Jesus. So I appreciate that.
My natural bent is, I describe myself as a lament guy. That's just my natural bent. And so I take great comfort in the Psalms that say, hey, God, this is all going wrong today. I don't understand this. I don't know what's going on. And yet I still trust you. And just to have that sense of, God welcoming, holding me even through those times when things don't seem in my eyes to be going well. I think there's power in just acknowledging, like, man, this is not how I wanted it. I even prayed about it, and yet I still know you are with me and for me in some way that I just may not recognize at this moment. And so for me, that helps carry myself through in my own walk. But that's also just not naturally inclined.
I think that takes being on the journey for a while to get to that mature place. I appreciate that. All right, we're still in Thessalonica, and it's already an hour into us. So we got 2 more cities to visit. So let's move on. They get in trouble. They're gonna get arrested. So they sneak them out of town and they send them 60 miles away to Berea. Someone want to read? You didn't get a chance to read. You want to read?
That very night, brothers and sisters sent Paul and Silas off to Berea, and when they arrived, they went to the Jewish synagogue. These Jews were more receptive than those in Thessalonica, for they welcomed the message very eagerly and examined the scriptures every day to see whether these things were so. Many of them there believed, the Jews that would be, including not a few Greek women and men of high standing.
Not a few.
Not
A few. Yeah.
Not a few. But when the Jews of Thessalonica learned that the word of God had been proclaimed by Paul and Berea as well, they came there too. And these were the Jews that came to stir up and incite the crowds. Then the brothers and sisters immediately sent Paul away to the coast, but Silas and Timothy remained behind. Those who conducted Paul brought him as far as Athens, and after receiving instructions to have Silas and Timothy join him as soon as possible, they left him.
So we pick up a little bit of some of the same things we just heard from Thessalonica, although now the Jews are more receptive. So this message that the Messiah has come. I've often wondered about the Jewish resistance to the Messiah coming. Long waited, long prophesied, long hopeful, but they got so caught up into some of the details of what it meant for Jesus to come as the King of the Jews that they just had a hard time translating it. But for the Jews in Berea, they were open to it. They received it. They welcomed it, and they were transformed by that. And not just them, but not just a few Greek women. That message, what? A bunch of them. Yeah, a bunch of them. And now it's the men of high status that catch on. So they're a little slow because they finally caught up. But it's interesting. In Thessalonica, those folks that were stirring up trouble, they found out now they're doing it in Berea. So now they send a delegation to go there and tell the people in Berea that there's a problem with these people, and you should get rid of them. And we know that there was a problem because they ushered Paul out and put him on a boat and sent him to Athens.
I think it was 30 miles away.
I think it's up from where? Thessalonica, Berea, I think it's 60 miles, according to one of the commentaries. It's interesting. This is interesting. That Thessalonica had a bunch of problems. There was resistance there. That ended up having a very strong church, very strong church. Berea, who had a very receptive audience, there was no church that ever got a foothold there. I don't know what to do with that. I just think it's interesting that some of the churches, maybe some of the churches that developed some of the greatest resistance, had some of the greatest resistance, had some of the greatest conversion. You know, and maybe that's why. And we see that true in Paul's life. Maybe this is just an example, and again, of when there's this dramatic conversion, when there's this sense that I was up against it, and now I've seen the light and know that maybe that creates a sincerity, maybe that creates an energy that can't be there if you're. I don't know what to do with that, but it's just, I think it's just interesting. Again, we see the same thing we pointed out before. The gospel is for everyone. This good news that the Messiah has come is for everybody. And we know it's for everyone because everyone is responding. The Spirit is leading, is opening their minds, opening their eyes, and opening their hearts, and they're responding to it. But it's not without its resistance. Just a quick question, and we got to get to Athens today for sure. But it's interesting. Paul gets on the boat, but not Silas and Timothy. What's going on there, do you think? What's that?
Why would they have something against Paul? Except maybe because he was the one who was speaking, but it doesn't make sense that the others would stay behind for a while.
Two thoughts. It didn't make sense to me either. I go, if it's unsafe for Paul, it's probably unsafe for them as well. So maybe they all get on the boat and head to Athens together. It does say at the very end of this part of the chapter that he says, as soon as he leaves instructions to Silas and Timothy to join him as soon as possible. So there must have been stuff for them to do. There must have been things that Paul wanted them to do to establish the work that he was doing, to leave something in order, some structure that was going to be able to help to do the work that he was hoping to leave behind. It also suggested to me this great reminder, right, is that Paul wasn't the whole package. Paul had his gifts and abilities and talents, but he didn't have them all. But Silas and Timothy had some other gifts. We often see these guys being left behind to help establish the church. Paul was the evangelist. Paul was the guy offering the message. Paul was the guy who was telling the truth. And then Silas and Timothy and others helped to establish that community that was then formed around this truth that he'd been told of the transformation that happened by the power of the Spirit. It's a great reminder.
And if they all ran away, the whole thing would have just folded immediately.
Yeah,
It's like you were here, you told us, and then you just ran away.
yeah.
Kind of like every crusade. The group hangs back.
Yeah. I remember the last time the Billy Graham crusade came, and I was on a couple of teams for it because he was always a big hero and very instrumental in my early faith development. And one was I was a part of their security team, but the other part was about the helping to create spaces for people who came to faith during the crusade, and setting up opportunities for people if they wanted further discipleship and further conversations. And it was interesting because it was leaving behind a remnant of people then that would be able to serve those people that came to faith. So where does Paul go? Paul goes to Athens. Gets on a ship and goes as far away so those troublemakers in Thessalonica can't find them. So what do we know about Athens? Anybody know anything about Athens? interesting because it's kind of headquarters for two places in two ways. Kind of two worlds kind of colliding in Athens.
Capital of the Greek Empire.
Yeah, it's capital of the religious part of the Greek Empire, for sure. What else do we know about it? Might not know this.
Well, it's where the philosophy,
Yeah.
the Greek philosophy and Greek culture was all centered there.
And absolutely right, but it's also the intellectual capital of Rome as well. Probably because of all what was already happening there, that Rome capitalized on that as they ushered in and brought new understanding to the Roman influence of the world. So Paul shows up in Athens. And again, just set some context. Paul's never been there before. It's Athens. Just kind of how it captures our imagination to go to Athens. We think of all the things we're going to see and all the places we go. I mean, I've never been there, but some of you probably have. I mean, Athens is spectacular. The things you can see, the places you can go and understand it, the history that's there. Well, there was already a whole bunch of that there, a whole bunch of it there. And so for Paul, he's half crusader, but the other half, he's tourist. He's getting to go to Athens and see where all this is happening. And all this has happened. And so and we know that because verse 16 in this chapter, while Paul was waiting for them, meaning Paul and Silas in Athens, he must have wandered around. He must have taken a look at what was going on in the city. What does it say in verse 60? He was deeply distressed to see that the city was full of idols. He had his imagination was different. What he imagined about Athens was different than what he experienced. And so what does he do? That's what he always does. He goes to the synagogue and starts to have conversations with the Jews. But he doesn't just spend time with the Jews here. He also goes and talks to the devout persons also in the marketplace. I looked devout up, and devout doesn't necessarily mean spiritually devout, but devout to a philosophy, or to a belief system, to an understanding of life. He goes to talk to the people that are in the marketplace every day, thinking about lofty ideas and lofty thoughts and how things could go. And he actually runs into two very distinct philosophical groups. We'll get to that in a second. The Epicureans and the Stoics. But we're not quite there yet. It's interesting, as he says, so he argued in the synagogue with the Jews and devout persons and also in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be there. So he was sowing seeds, wasn't he, Tom? Whoever's there, it's going to get the opportunity to hear from him. And as he shares them, he's running into all kinds of people. He must have said, because it gets pretty intense here in about 2 verses, he must have said some things that got some people a little shook because they start calling them names. The Epicureans and Stoic philosophers debated with him, and someone said, "What is this pretentious babbler want to say?" And they called him babbler because he didn't follow normative rules for having these philosophical questions and conversations. He didn't follow the rule. You're supposed to bring a story and illuminate the story and suggest principles for living that can come out of that. And then you invite people. No, he came and he started preaching. He started telling them what they needed to know. He declares, "Hey, you folks of Athens, what's going on here?" And so they call him a babbler. These Epicureans and Stoic philosophers. It's interesting. These two philosophical understandings of life couldn't be more different from each other. So he is standing right between these two major philosophies of Athens. The Epicureans, it was all about pleasure, which we can almost imagine from the Greek culture, right? It's all about pleasure. Chief purpose in life is to experience pleasure. They want a peaceful, satisfying, free from pain, undeterred from whatever they want that would make them feel good and feel good about life. They're filled with all kinds of superstitious fears, but they're trying to keep them at odds. They're trying to keep them at arm's length away, especially death. Because that's the major undoing of this life that brings them so much happiness and pleasure and hope. So let's not talk about it. They don't talk about it. They don't talk about it. And they don't deny the existence of gods. They just don't think they're relevant to creation. They don't think they're relevant to humans. And so again, it's what they can produce, what they can experience, what they can have, what brings them joy and happiness and fulfillment. That's what they're focused on 100% of the time. Then you got the Stoic philosophers, and they're kind of the opposite. They're pantheists. And so they've got to think about all the gods. They got to think about how they respond in a likable way or a meaningful way to all the gods. They're all about being proud of what they can achieve and being proud of how good they can be. Following, and in some ways, they're an extension of the Pharisees in some ways. And to the degree that if they can't live that way, if they can't live in a way that is honoring to all the gods and following clearly their philosophy of life, then they're better off dead. That's the achievement. It's for someone to go, look at them. Look how they live their life. Wow. And if not, then what's the purpose of life? So he's standing in between those. He's not following the rules of normal debate, and they call him babblers. And they call him out. He says he seems to be a proclaimer of foreign divinities. One commentary, very interesting, said this must have wounded Paul greatly. Why? Why would that have wounded Paul greatly? He seems to be a proclaimer of foreign divinities.
Dual.
What?
Dual.
Yeah.
They're looking at Jesus and the resurrection as separate gods.
Yeah. Paul's like, there ain't any other gods. This is it. Jesus is the manifestation of God's faithfulness. And for them to just throw him into a category, oh, he's just talking about another one. Just add him to the list. That meant Paul would have, that would have wounded him and hurt him, and that would have probably got him going a little bit. Oh yeah, I'm gonna do some teaching. I'm gonna do some encouraging. I'm gonna redirect your thinking as best I'm able. And he begins to talk about this Jesus, this resurrection, but he's very clever in how he does this, right? He walks around and he sees all these gods, and then he stumbles upon this one statue, this one place of worship. To who?
The unknown God.
Unknown God. Unknown God. This is the Greeks covering their bases. We've got all the known Greek gods, but we could have missed one. We're just humans. And so in case we've missed one, we don't want to make them mad. So we're going to have a temple for them as well. It was interesting. They had 600 years before Paul, there was a plague that was running through Athens. And so, of course, they believe that somehow they got the gods mad, right? So they've got to make some kind of sacrifice. They got to make amends with God so that the gods will show favor on them again. So this one guy decides that he's going to set loose in the city of Athens a huge flock of sheep. And sheep go in. And what he says is wherever they lay down, we sacrifice, we kill that sheep in the name of the God that's closest. And for the sheep that don't lay down, their deaths all go to the unknown. So they literally recovered all the bases when they think about how they were trying to reconnect with God. I thought that was an interesting story that I stumbled upon. They really gave a lot of credit, a lot of attention to this unnamed God. So Paul is very clever. You know what? You don't have to wonder who they are anymore. You don't have to wonder who this God is. I can tell you. It's Jesus. It's Jesus. And he went so far as to say that this God who has come to creation also showed how powerful this God is by bringing someone who was dead back to life. Now, that would have caught their attention. Why? Because this life was so important. In all the philosophies they were dealing with, this life is so important because they weren't sure about what happens next. There was no future hope. There was no sense of heaven. There was no place that they're going to dwell. It was uncertain. And so this life, and so, oh, this God has a power that can sustain life and give us longer life. Oh, must have caught their attention. Of course, that's not how it works, right? We still have a finite life that we live, which is important for us to know and remember and understand that. And he points them to this God. But what he does is different than what other philosophies and philosophers have done before. He points them as we look later into the chapter. He says, you know what? But you can't just add this one to the whole list. You got to make a decision. We get down to verse 29 and following. Since we are God's offspring, we ought not to think that the deity is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by art and the imagination of mortals. We don't get to decide what God is like or who God is or how God will appear. You don't get to form that God. You don't get to create that God. You're the created, so you have no influence on that. God is already God. Verse 30, while God has overlooked the times of human ignorance, others have tried to do this before you. Now he commands all people everywhere to repent. You can't just add this named now God to the whole list of other gods. You got to make a decision. You got to turn from that philosophy or that belief, and you got to adopt this and let this be the guiding principles of your life. Verse 31, because he has fixed a day in which he will have the whole world judged and righteous by man, Jesus, whom he has appointed. And of this he has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead. This God, this unnamed God, this is the God that has come to you, invited you into a relationship with him. And he has the power to create and to bring back to life that which is dead. And we know this because of Jesus. My question is, and I couldn't find an answer to this, my question is, had the same experience in Athens happened that had happened in Thessalonica? Had word kind of gotten as far as Athens about what had happened in Jerusalem? I don't know. I don't think so. But I wonder if would that have created some of this willingness to be open to that? Oh, this God that you're not talking about, we've kind of heard rumors about that. But there is a power that's there. There was some transformation that happened. I don't know. It made me wonder. But verse 32, when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some scoffed, but others said, we will hear you again about this. And at that point, Paul left them. And then it says some of them joined him and became believers. And it actually names a couple of these people. And of course, Luke is very helpful there, right? That there wasn't just this idea that maybe something happened, that maybe there was a foothold that happened there. No, there were actually some folks that were identified as followers. And upon them and these transformed lives of others, the church was formed there too. But what we did kind of pass over a little bit is this notion that what he would do was he would open up the scriptures. He would open up the sacred documents and he would talk about the prophecies. He would talk about how Jesus had lived out those prophecies. He would talk through the whole story of God at work in creation. It wasn't just a clever one-time speech. There would have been more to it than that. The fact that we will hear you again about this kind of is a tip of the hat towards that there's going to be an openness to more study, more understanding, more conversations. And through that, believers have. So my takeaway from this chapter was, as we've identified in all three of these cities, the gospel goes out and it transforms the lives of everybody. Everyone who is willing and open. It's not going to be just one religious group. It's not going to be just one understanding of life. It's going to be whoever might be open to it. But there is a power of that spirit that creates a space where God can work. And if we are open to that, then we're in our own. And we see the expression of that, we see the evidence of that, we see examples of that as we continue to live the good vows. And the question that I would leave with you today is a question that I continue to ask myself. And it's a question that we kind of started with when we first started this morning. Is in terms of our relationship with God, our understanding of Jesus. We got up this morning, we came to Bible study, so obviously that means something to us. The question that we always have to wrestle with is, okay, what, so what? Okay. Good news for us, transformational for us, hopeful for us. But what else? Is it just supposed to be for us? Is it just supposed to be good news for us? That we've got our story, we've got our hope, we've got our future beliefs good to go? Or is there something about the fact that this story could go on to so many others because of the faithfulness of a few that challenges us to think about maybe it's not just for us. Maybe it's helpful that we get to know that for us, but maybe there's something that calls us and compels us beyond just us. Anyone want to make a comment about that? Yeah, all three of you.
Okay.
There.
First of all, we have our own marketplace in Minneapolis today. That we have people from all over the world. And not all of them are believers or receptive to Christ. So there you are. We are in Athens now.
Thanks a lot.
God's engaged in the world. And we're free to either go along with that and try to be a part of that engagement, or we can be a part of the divisiveness that separates us.
Yeah, the world has come here. The world has come to our doorsteps, and that means that we can learn and we can grow in so many ways, as opposed to somehow we kind of focus here. And we get to make a choice, right? Are we going to engage in that or not? You know, and engage in a way that we then can also be transformed by the truth that's out there for us.
Does it necessarily mean that when people do not believe in Christianity that they're sinners? No, there is lost soul. We just haven't heard the word, and that's our job to do in different forms, not to go send it down their throats, but to show God's love from actions that we will do among them. That's what he said, feed my sheep.
You know, one of the things that happens often in Paul's letters is he talks a lot about how they live their lives. At first glance, you could say, oh, that's because he's an old Pharisee, so he wants to kind of order their lives and construct their lives in such a way that, you know, is meaningful. I don't think that's the case. I think he says to live the life of faith in a way because that's where the world will go, oh, clearly there's some truth to that in terms of the way they live their life. They believe that, and it's transformed their life. Sometimes we think we have to convert, we have to get that number on our, belt buckle. All we really are called to do is to bear witness. As I often say, is that, and you've heard me say this, we're just one beggar showing another beggar where the food is, right? We believe there's been a transforming experience in our lives, and we have the opportunity to bear witness of that and share that. At the end of the day, it's not our job to judge. It's not our job to condemn. It's not our job to point the finger. It's our job to continue to do that very thing, to continue to love and to continue to encourage.
There's a lot of those questions that come from unbelievers in the island that I was born in. They say, why do you do what you do? You do it so well. And the answer we give them is, we have a God that lives. Not a God that dead. And some of them know that already. Some of them tell you, we don't have a God, no God lives. They say exactly what. They're aware of it. So it's our job to try and open that door and show them. Maybe they're kind of blurred vision about it. God's
Yeah, I really appreciate that. You know, in my mind's eye, I see these devout followers go into the temple of Zeus or Apollos or wherever. They bring their offerings, you know, day after day or however, following the different ceremonies. The one thing that is different about Christmas is that we're not waiting. We're not waiting for that God to show up. We're not begging that God to show up. We're not pleading with that God to show up. Sometimes we do in life circumstances, we do. If there's circumstance situations, we're begging God and pleading to God to open that God's going to show up in the way that we want God to show up. But we don't have to. Because as we've talked about, God does hear our prayers. God is actively engaged in creation. God comes to us and continues to come to us and is that promised presence of the Spirit in us. And so that changes the way we approach God. It changes the way we think about ourselves and the value that we have. It changes that understanding that we are not these awful people, these created beings that whatever they offer is not going to be good enough. And so God's not impressed, and so God doesn't show up. That's where he showed up and showed us by the life and death of Jesus, right? And so we know we have that. We know we have purpose. We know we have hope, or we can know that. I just think a stark contrast to what Paul experienced in Athens and the hope that he tried to offer them. It's pretty powerful. Who wants the last comment today? What's the takeaway for us today? Yes, sir.
Well, I'm just thinking, I mean, this is a pretty remarkable story because there was no mass communication in these days. There's no TV, there's no radio, there's no internet. So the word has to pass verbally from one person to another. And so I said before, it's remarkable that it has stayed alive and grown. And it's more remarkable when you think about the world they lived in and how it had to get done. It had to get done like this.
Yeah, it is remarkable. But the one thing that I thought about is you think about our fast-paced life and how, you know, this, that, 14 things you have to get accomplished to make it. I mean, sometimes they're sitting on ships. The sails are up,
No wind.
and they're like, let me tell you a story I heard when I was in Athens, or when I was, so some of it happened life to life because the pace was a little bit different. And so people would stop and go, no, I want to hear that story. Let me hear that story. Or somebody was passing through town and they had no place to stay, so they were sleeping on your floor. And before they go to sleep, where are you from? What are you doing? What do you think? And the way that world was structured back then, the way that it's very different than the world we are. And God used it. Yeah, God used it in some different ways. You get the very last word.
Okay, I really loved your image on the sermon of setting your sail to catch the wind of the Spirit.
Yeah, we don't know when the wind's coming.
Right.
But
I'm a sailor, so I understand that, but I think it's interesting.
Yeah.
That it has to be set so that you can only move in certain directions given where the wind is coming from.
I'll have the last word since you raised that. So Steve Coleman, George Lancaster, and Dave Westman are all captains, sailing captains. So over the years, we have done, I think, 4 men's sailing trips. And we've gone up to the Apostle Islands. I've only been on Steve Coleman's boat because if I'm on Steve's boat, nothing bad's going to happen. That's just nothing bad's going to happen. I got no reason to prove it. Nothing's going to happen. But I remember the very first sailing trip. I'd never been on a sailing boat. I mean, I've been on a few power boats, running around, but never on a sailing. So I had no idea how sailing actually worked. But one of the things that Steve liked to do as captain of his boat is he liked to give sailing away to the people on his boat. He didn't just like to go, I'm the captain, so you guys sit there and look at, watch for seagulls. But we were putting sails up, we were driving, steering. We got to do it all. We got to fire up the Iron Jenny, one of these things. But I remember we were out. Finally, we got out in the big water from the port we were in, and I remember him looking out the back of the boat, Is that the stern? Looking out the back of the boat. We were all kind of putting sails out. I remember him turning the boat just a little bit, because we had the edge of it just really, really low, so he had some maneuverability. He goes, guys, he goes, look at the water. And we looked, and none of us saw anything. We'll see the ripples coming, the wind's coming. And all of a sudden our sails went, and we took off. He knew that. And not only did he know that, he knew what to look for so he could see it coming. So he had us put the sails up, he positioned the boat, and when the wind came, it was pretty amazing. And so when you say that, I go, I live that, I experience that, I believe that. And I think that's a great metaphor for us.
And you can't get from here to the clock in a straight line. If the wind is coming from the clock this way, you have to tack.
Oh, yeah. So it's something, you know what I'm saying?
But there's no one.
All right, I'm gonna close the prayer since we kept you fast. So guess what? We'll be back in chapter 18. So let's bring that back next week.
We say this, it's still good.
There's still unused portions of it. So we got caught up into some of the details. That's fun. God, thanks for this group. Thanks for the things that I've learned from them today. Thanks for the things that you have used them to remind me of what it means to walk this journey of faith. We're walking together. Lord, we are grateful that the seeds have been sown. That the word goes out. You're in charge of where it takes you. So God, we pray that you would help us to live a life that's understanding that, and live a life that is led by the love that you give us first. And we pray that we can offer this good news and offer it in a way that is meaningful and helpful and loving to the community around us. So God, minister to us according to our needs.
Thank you.
Thank you. So nobody showed up online today. Thanks for watching. Yes, ma'am.
I took a sailing boat to Apostle Island when you connect me. You called a woman. Took me on that sail. And I was there for 12 weeks.
So you must have seen all the islands up there. Did you go all the way out to Isle Royal?
No.
We met like
Um,
every other.
we
week.
had a family or cottage actually at Okanoki in Iowa. And some years ago, when my mom was doing one, I was gonna ask you to tell me she wanted to use a cottage for a week. So I, oh, wow, it really would. Also, I wanted to tell you, I'm doing
Anyway, and
a
people.
paper on, it's called In Memory of Her by Elizabeth Ransom. And she wrote right
No,
now,
but they
so,
can remember that.
anyway, it's very different, such way at the beginning of the woman's, place in church. And it's very, very interesting. So if I can write something or talk about it, know how it's. Right.
Great idea.
You gotta have a project, though.
I know. You got a project?
I'm doing a brief history of Old Land.
You are? Really?
Yeah, I just wanna say, you're really good at this.
Oh,
You are.
No, I mean,
Yeah.
yeah,
I agree.
fun.
well, you know, you do something very different. You teach in a different way than Christian. Christian has the outline of the way. And then we kind of talk about it, just talk about it. You have the scripture and then we create the points, you know, and that works for me better, but anyway, I mean, they're both good, but this is really effective, really engaging people.
Fun for me. So appreciate
Did
that.
you ever think of going into the pastorate?
Not the teaching part of it as much. I always feel the pressure of that when somebody goes, well, but what about that? Where is that? And I can't keep all those facts in my head.
You know, I think I didn't want to open it up because it's going forever. But, you know, I'm thinking about the word spreading, you know, and people who have been called to spread it. And I read somewhere that, you know, all of the 12 apostles ended up dying for their faith, you know.
And the remaining,
So while this is going on, I mean, there's other people out doing some of this, most of which we don't know about. But I mean, it's all one-on-one, but I mean, the apostles are spread all over the world.
and many of them, if you might recall, many of them that lasted longer stayed in Jerusalem to kind of be the center place for when the letters would come and the ideas would come, the questions would come, because we know all got some in there a few times, right? Others got some in there, but what are you doing? Of course, they need to be circumcised. Well, wait, maybe they don't need to be circumcised. So, but you're right. 10 of the remaining 11.
I mean, I wish there was a way you could see this, you know, while this is going on in Thessalonica, there's stuff going on in other places and the people are back in Jerusalem, you know. I mean, there's a bunch of stories happening at one time, most of which we don't know about anymore.
That's right. You're right. I bet you somebody's done some writing about that. I've never read anything like that, but I mean, we've kind of just assumed that that's the reality because of the way the church.
Well, most of the apostles didn't leave a big trail of stuff though.
They did not.
Okay.
Thanks. I think I heard that. Have a good rest of your day.
Okay.
No secrets around here.
No secrets. Oh, sorry.